Pokrovsk was supposed to have fallen. The Donetsk-based city was meant to be in Russia's control, and it was being used as a push-off point for assaults deeper into the region. But that just changed. Something extraordinary is happening in Pokrovsk as Ukraine just pulled off an insane 3-kilometer breakthrough in the region. Russia just got caught with its pants down. But the bigger story is that Pokrovsk is just one example of what is happening all across the front lines as deep strikes and counterattacks give Ukraine all of the momentum. Let's start with what happened in Pokrovsk. On May 19th, the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, Serhiy Bratchuk, revealed that Ukraine's assault teams had managed to wedge themselves deep into the Pokrovsk region that Russia claims to control. A brutal push took the Ukrainian defense forces up to 3 kilometers deep through the Russian defense lines, as a series of counterattacks showed that Ukraine has the perfect answer to the reserves that Putin is pumping into the Pokrovsk region right now. Those reserves are poorly trained and ill-prepared for what the more experienced Ukrainian fighters bring to the table. Ukraine just showed Putin why that's a problem, with Bratchuk labeling what's just happened as being more than ordinary tactical actions. Bratchuk revealed what he could to UATV. If we're talking about Pokrovsk, I cannot name the exact location for obvious reasons, but here the defense forces managed to carry out not just tactical counterattacks, they can be called breakthrough actions, Bratchuk declared before adding, because in some locations our forces managed to wedge themselves 3 kilometers into the depth of the Russian occupiers' defense. Then he delivered the last message that Putin wanted to hear, and the operation continues. As Russia tries to prioritize Donetsk, Ukraine is launching clever counterattacks in the regions where Putin's forces are weakest. Pokrovsk now appears to be one of those regions, and if Bratchuk is right, what we've just seen isn't a one-off, it's a starting point for more operations that Ukraine will use to push deeper into the Russian defensive lines, which, in turn, has massive ramifications for what Putin is planning for the rest of Donetsk. And there's more. We gained a little insight into what Ukraine's Pokrovsk push looked like from Ukraine's 413th Unmanned Systems Forces Regiment, otherwise known as the RAID Regiment. In a post on X, RAID shared a video of one of their drones scoring direct hits on a Russian command post nestled in the remains of a high-rise building in Pokrovsk. The video is interesting. As each drone follows the last, we see the command post degrade to the point where it's a flaming wreck. That command post was being used by the 9th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, or SMRB, of the 51st Army of the Russian Federation, RAID revealed, and it's been deliberately set up in the ruins of a high-rise building because Russia hoped that this would make the post impossible to detect. Russia was wrong. The destruction of the command post of the 9th SMRB from the 51st Army will weaken the enemy's capabilities to plan and coordinate offensive actions in the Donbass, RAID declared. That's a little hint about why Ukraine's push into Pokrovsk is so important. But what will really devastate Putin is that Bratchuk reveals that the Ukrainian counterattack in Pokrovsk is just one of several similar operations happening all over Donetsk. Beyond Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces are pushing in the Mirnorad, Liman, and Konstantinivka directions, where they are slowly reversing Russian gains that took Putin's forces months to make. This is a campaign that impacts all of Donetsk, as Ukraine is shattering the Russian lines in what is now supposed to be the rear, which is crippling Russia's attempts to push deeper into Donetsk. But hold on a second, you might be thinking. How could any of this be possible? Pokrovsk was supposed to have fallen to Russia a long time ago. Now we're almost halfway through 2026. Surely that region should be under Russia's full control. That's certainly what Putin and his cronies wanted you to think. But the reality is far more complex. Russia does indeed claim to hold Pokrovsk. The Kremlin has been making that claim for a while now, stretching back to when the Chief of Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, said that Pokrovsk was under Russia's control on December 1, 2025. Gerasimov was so eager to spread this news that the Kremlin even announced it on Telegram, and he even reported the news directly to Putin. Not coincidentally, the news of Russia's capture of Pokrovsk arrived just at the right time for Putin to use it as leverage in peace talks that were held a few days later. It wasn't long before the Russian lies were exposed. The day after Gerasimov's claims, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, claimed that it hadn't seen any evidence to suggest that Russia had completed the seizure of Pokrovsk. The ISW also cast doubt on whether the city, assuming that it fell, would actually serve as the good base for the rest of Russia's plans in Donetsk that Putin claimed it would be. At the time, Ukraine still had fortifications in the west, north, and northeast of Pokrovsk that were complicating Russia's attempts to advance through the region. Of course, all of this was reported at the end of 2025. Russia has made more progress since then, and there are no illusions about the Pokrovsk situation being good for Ukraine. But it's also not as cut and dry as Russia wants it to appear. There is still fighting ongoing in that region, as well as in the city that Russia claims to hold. We know that due to comments made by the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Alexander Syrskyi, who claims that Russia has amassed around 99,000 soldiers in the Pokrovsk direction, which amounts to the largest Russian grouping across the entire front in Ukraine. That's a lot of soldiers, sure, but these are soldiers who should be amassed around the Donetsk fortress belt, and particularly the city of Konstantinivka. The fact that they're built up in the Pokrovsk region tells us two things. First, Pokrovsk isn't quite the good base for launching new attacks that Putin claimed it to be. If it were, those 99,000 soldiers would be pushing much deeper into Donetsk, bringing Putin closer to his stated goal of taking the Donbass by September. That seems like an impossible deadline, especially now that Ukraine is pushing back in Pokrovsk. And second, the troop buildup in Pokrovsk tells us that Russia is concerned about losing ground. Russia is setting up defensive lines in a region that it claims to fully control because it knows that portions of that control are far weaker than Russia wants to admit. Now, the Kremlin doesn't have to admit anything. Ukraine just showed the world that it can make progress in Pokrovsk. So the situation in Pokrovsk isn't as good for Russia as the Kremlin claims, but it gets so much worse when you start to look at what's happening behind the lines. A 3-kilometer counterattack is great news for Ukraine. It shows that there are weaknesses in Russia's Donetsk defenses that can be exploited. But behind the problem, there is a much bigger issue. Before we dig deeper into that, this is a reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you're getting insight from the channel, then make sure that you are subscribed. We break it down like this every single week. Putin's much bigger problem in Pokrovsk is this: the strikes in the rear are as dangerous, if not more so, than Ukraine's counterattack on the front. Bratchuk highlights this, telling UATV, "There were strikes deep into the temporarily occupied territory against what is connected to enemy logistics, and this affects the intensity of combat operations and Russian ability to continue the aggressive war. It's the middle-range campaign that is really hurting Russia in Pokrovsk and the wider Donetsk region. The destruction of the command post that we highlighted earlier offers an example, but it goes much deeper than that. As The Independent points out, Ukraine has been pouring a huge amount of resources into being able to execute strikes in the range of 30 to 180 kilometers behind the front lines. These attacks target things like command posts, as we've already seen, along with military vehicles, air defenses, and logistics. These types of attacks won't change the course of the war on their own. But what they do is open up opportunities for assaults elsewhere. That's what we've likely just seen in Pokrovsk. Using its new generation of middle-range drones, Ukraine has battered the Russian rear in the Pokrovsk region. The beating that Russia took will have led to some of its frontline troops losing support, and perhaps even communications capabilities with their commanders. Chaos ensues. Russia's defenses become less organized, and that's when Ukraine's assault teams are able to strike, taking out the scattered Russian troops to dig deep into the defensive lines. Bratchuk claims that these middle-range strikes won't reduce Russian assaults. He may be wrong about that, as you'll learn in a few minutes. But even if he were right, the main point he makes is that Ukraine's middle-range strategy, when combined with its counterattacks and the fearsome defenses it has set up elsewhere in Donetsk, is forcing a level of attrition that Russia simply can't handle. However, the problem for them has become, in particular, replenishing the losses that they are sustaining, Bratchuk says of Russia's forces in Donetsk. The enemy's daily losses are steadily reaching around 1,000 killed and wounded. These are heavy losses for the Russians. They are forced to use strategic reserves for other purposes, to plug their own gaps instead of trying to break through to us. Again, we likely saw this in Pokrovsk. As massive as a gathering of 99,000 soldiers in that region may be, it doesn't mean much as an offensive force when Russia is losing so many soldiers that those troops are being used to close gaps in the lines rather than to launch assaults. Let's hone in on Bratchuk's comments about Russia's losses for a moment. There are some interesting figures coming out of the last couple of months that lend some context to how bad things really are for Russia. According to Siersky, Russia is now losing 3.5 times more soldiers than Ukraine across the entire front. The ratio gets even worse for Russia when comparing the number of soldiers killed on each side. On some days, Siersky claims Russia is losing between 7 and 9 soldiers to death for every 1 Ukrainian soldier that is killed. That alone highlights the lack of sustainability that Bratchuk discusses. Dead soldiers can't be cycled back onto the battlefield, whereas wounded soldiers may be able to recover and fight again. But we can go even deeper. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Russia's military losses for April amounted to 35,203 killed or wounded. Similar losses were recorded in March, giving us a total of around 70,000. Now let's apply Siersky's ratio to that total. What we see is that Ukraine has lost about 20,000 soldiers to death or injury between March and April, compared to the 70,000 that Russia lost. And again, remember that Russia is losing a lot more soldiers to death than it is to injury. On March 10th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that 62% of Russia's casualties amount to kills achieved by Ukraine versus 38% wounded. So 70,000 casualties in 2 months amounts to 43,400 soldiers that Russia will never get back. That's more than twice the number of total Ukrainian casualties for the same period. Bratchuk appears to have a point. Russia is losing soldiers at a rate that can't be sustained. And somehow we can go even deeper into the maths to highlight just how bad things are for Russia in Donetsk. On April 8th, United 24 media reported that Russia is losing 316 soldiers per square kilometer that they capture in the Donetsk region. There are about 6,000 square kilometers of that region left to capture. If we're talking about sustainability, then the maths here is a problem for Putin. At this rate, Russia will have to sacrifice almost 1.9 million soldiers to finally take Donetsk. It's not looking good for the 99,000 troops gathered in Pokrovsk. Russia will have burned through all of those soldiers in a matter of months. Then it will need more and more. Donetsk still won't have fallen. Throw Ukraine making gains in Pokrovsk into the mix, along with all of the medium-range strikes that Ukraine is conducting, and the situation goes from bad to worse for Russia. Ukraine pulled off the extraordinary in Pokrovsk. Russia was caught with its pants down, and it's going to spend the next few months getting a spanking. And the craziest thing about all of this is that Putin is going to continue to order his troops to march cheek first into the Ukrainian battle. The deputy head of the Ukrainian president's office, Pavlo Palisa, says that Donetsk is going to be Russia's main point of focus as the failed spring offensive moves into summer. Putin's goal is still to reach the Donetsk administrative border, and that means he needs a stable Pokrovsk from which to launch assaults and a collapsed fortress belt. He has neither. He's not even close to having these two things. But Putin will still order attacks, which are growing weaker by the month as Ukraine shatters the Russian rear and regains ground in Pokrovsk. Russia will continue to push, but the situation is starting to crumble. And that brings us nicely back to Bratchuk's comments about Russia maintaining its level of assaults. That may not be accurate. On May 19th, Syrskyi revealed that Ukraine has reached parity with Russia in terms of the number of assaults it's conducting, and on some days, it's Ukraine that comes out ahead in that area. For example, yesterday, the general did not specify the exact day, the situation was characterized by the fact that the number of our offensive actions for the first time exceeded the number of offensive actions by the enemy, Syrskyi claimed in an interview with Military. Now, Syrskyi didn't state when yesterday was. The interview was published on May 9th, but it may have been filmed before then. But the takeaway here is that Ukraine is hitting Russia harder than Russia is hitting Ukraine. That isn't supposed to be happening. And it's an insane achievement for Ukraine when Russia has gathered 99,000 troops in Pokrovsk. The pressure is starting to be put on Putin's forces, and 3 kilometers gained in Pokrovsk is proof that the pressure is starting to pay off. Zelensky also has plenty to say about what we're now seeing in Pokrovsk, Donetsk, and the entire battlefield. In his May 19th daily address to his people, Ukraine's president said that the tide is turning across the front. This month has brought a shift in the dynamics in our favor, in Ukraine's favor. We are holding more positions and inflicting more damage. The impact of our long-range sanctions against Russia has been especially significant. Zelensky also confirmed that he has approved Ukraine's long-range plans for June. We'll get back to why that's important after we highlight something else that is shifting in the Ukraine war. Military reforms are underway that are designed to make Ukraine an even more powerful fighting force than it already is. In his interview with Military, Syrskyi said that new contracts are being created, higher pay is going to be offered to Ukraine's soldiers, and better mechanisms are being put in place to govern the dismissal from service for soldiers who have fulfilled their contracts. In particular, more financial incentives are going to be offered to soldiers who fill the most urgent positions on the battlefield, which will do wonders for morale. Ukraine's push into Pokrovsk and its counterattacks elsewhere have already created a buoyant mood as Ukraine feels momentum shifting in its favor. These reforms have been timed perfectly to enable Ukraine to build on its successes. Now, the deep strikes, what makes them so important? Zelensky is so keen to highlight that he has approved plans for Ukraine's deep strike campaign because they play into what we've already discussed, the gradual whittling away of Russia's strength in the rear. In the occupied territories, middle-range drones are shattering the support system that Putin's patsies on the front require, which is creating the opportunities for Ukraine to launch the sorts of counterattacks that we're now seeing in Pokrovsk. However, the broader picture encompasses Ukraine's strikes deep into Russia itself. Ukraine's attacks on Russia's heartland have been causing serious problems. Ahead of the Pokrovsk breakthrough, Ukraine unleashed hundreds of drones against Moscow and mainland Russia, including a strike against the Perm oil refinery that is 1,500 kilometers away from Ukraine and has been hit several times in May. Ukraine's long-range campaign has become so massive that the Atlantic Council felt confident enough to say that Ukraine is winning the drone war in the May 19th piece. Ukraine's strikes against Russia's oil refineries and ports have limited Russia's ability to profit from its most valuable product, in addition to causing issues with getting fuel and other oil products to troops operating in Ukraine. Every attack against an air defense system inside occupied Ukraine opens up aerial pathways that Ukraine can use to launch more attacks against Russia. And even Ukraine's FPV drones have extended ranges, with some reaching distances of more than 70 kilometers to strike behind Russian lines. It's a death by 1,000 cuts strategy, and we're now starting to see it pay off. As impressive as Ukraine's counterattack in Pokrovsk is, it's just one example of many pushbacks that Ukraine has pulled off in 2026. Territory is being liberated in the south and the east. Russia's forces on the front are being weakened as their direct support in the occupied territories is destroyed, and Ukraine's long-range strikes intensify. The very foundation of the spring and summer offensive that was supposed to take Donetsk has crumbled. Ukraine is now ripping through the Russian front, and we may now be seeing the start of a wider counteroffensive that will expose Putin for the useless tactician that he really is. No matter where Putin looks, whether it's at the drones, the number of assaults being launched on the front, or even the amount of territory being taken, Ukraine is coming out on top. And now Russia's leader knows that not even his capital city is safe. There was no mercy, only revenge as Russia erupted into giant fireballs earlier in May. If you want to find out just how deadly Ukraine's long-range strategy has become, then check out our video covering Ukraine's retaliatory strikes in response to Russia's brutal actions in Kyiv. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show so you don't miss what we have in store next. And thank you for watching.